A history of Sweden.
As you can see on this picture, Sweden can be divided up in three parts, two big and one small in the around 1000. The south is the Gotlands, wherever you want to call it. The island in the Baltic Sea is Gotland, which is a big trading place. And the north are the Svealand. And they are uh, somewhat independent between each others, and all the regions are independent, and they aren't really a kingdom. There's more of a mix and match, chaos. Some important facts about Sweden is it's in the Middle Age is also very Baltic nation, a lot less North Sea nation. As you can see, there's a long coast along the Baltic Sea, and that's very important because a lot of trade was going on in the Baltics, and that was built up the Swedish economy, and the Baltic trade was important. The Baltic Sea. Second, the Swedish farmer was independent farmer or yeoman. How do you pronounce that? I don't know. And they always had some importance in the Swedish politics. They were used as soldiers. And because they owned their own land, they could be a lot more independent and choose which side they want to support. And that also make the nobility a lot weaker because they couldn't control the farmers at the same amount as other countries in Europe. And third is that from about 1000 to 1600 or something around that was a lot of Western influence in Sweden, and especially German influence. For example, Sweden didn't really have any cities, and the Swedish word for city is actually a German word. Basically, the Swedish didn't have a word for city because there didn't exist any cities in Sweden, or very few, or very small. So the Germans built up cities in Sweden through trade in the Hanseatic League. And the German cities in Sweden, or Swedish German living in Swedish cities, or whatever you want to call it, it helped Sweden to modernize the economy, which sounds maybe weird because of the Middle Ages, but that's true. A lot of new things from Europe or Western Europe were introduced through the German and the German trade. And before the Germans came, around 1000, give or take, the Swedish people accepted Christianity, and it was were not, I should say, not very known how they did it, but they did it. Maybe it was a king who adopted Christianity and forced everyone. Maybe it was a peasant who did it, and the king just did it for the peasants. But probably it was top down, not the other way around. Not very super important fact, but important fact is that Sweden was what I would call a tribal kingdom until 1250 around, and some noble families continuously wage war against each other, as you can see, my fine drawing, and that is a fact that explains somewhat the peasants' freedom, because of course if you constantly need the peasant to fight for you, you can't really demand anything between them. So you have constantly families, you don't know the names, basically constantly fighting against each other, and it makes the kingdom also very weak, because the kings never really can build up in a real kingdom, because they always been overthrown by the next king, and then he be killed, and then the son take over, then the other son who had been in Denmark come back, and then the other family king run over to Norway, and then he come back, and just continue for like 250 years. Eventually, the fighting between different families ended with one family winning, and then the kingdom was stabilized a bit. And funny fact about that is the name of the family is Folkungarna, and I don't know how to directly pronounce it, becomes People's Kings or something around that. Well, you can hear it's probably some propaganda keeping the peasant on your side. I don't know, maybe. Anyway, that means that Sweden can start looking outwards because of internal stability, and the objects they look for is to the east, to the Finnish tribes or Finland nowadays. And the reason for that, I would say, is you have Norway in the west north, who is pretty strong. Denmark, who is a lot much stronger than Sweden, I would say. You have the Holy Roman Empire or the Germany, and it's super much stronger than Sweden. You have the Teutonic Order who's starting to come around in the Baltics. So, and then you have Poland too. So Sweden it's the weakest area to conquer, and of course you go for the weakest area, but probably also very, very densely populated, because not densely, the other way around, of course. Very low population, because it wasn't a lot of towns or anything in Finland, what I know of, and it's kind of strange how they can build. Germans was coming up to Sweden or about now and building up the towns, and why didn't they do it in Finland? It probably has to do something about the low population in Finland that don't generate a lot of trade, and then it's not really worth it to go to Finland. But anyways, the Swedes thought it was worth it, and they over around 1,000 years or some 100 years conquered Finland, and it probably wasn't always conquering. Probably some tribes just went over to the Swedish side and was Christianized, and probably some tribes resisted, and it took some time, and was some rebellion, and the first priest there was killed, and you know how it goes. But around 100 years later, the Finland was a part of Sweden, and it would be it for 500 years. And Finland, the whole notion of Finland didn't exist, and the area was called the Eastern Land, simply. The Western Eastern Land. Sweden was the western, Finland was the eastern part. Why did the Swedish conquest Finland? I would say because of the church help, because we called it a crusade, and then the church helped with paying for the war, and paying for war is always hard. And second of all, by conquering you could get more land, and then the nobility that had been fighting in Sweden for centuries would be somewhat more peaceful. Second of all, as you can see, the arrow at the south shows that the Christianity moved northwest, and simply Finland was the last country on in that direction, so to speak. And that's probably why the Swedes were able to do it, because if the direction had come from Russia, for example, maybe it would be otherwise. Maybe Finland had conquered Sweden. But that didn't happen. The richest Swede who ever lived was Bo Jonsson, who lived in the Middle Ages. He owned a lot of Swedish land, and therefore was very rich for a time. Of course, there wasn't much other values besides mining and fields. So he was very rich, and he died and then everybody fight over his lands. In the late Middle Ages, as you can see, Sweden had grown into Finland and was expanding east. At the same time as Sweden was conquering Finland, the Folkungarna, or the new dynasty, was expanding the Swedish kingdom and also increasing the efficiencies of the ruling of Sweden. The most famous one is probably that Swedes got the common law instead of having many laws in every province. As I said, the Sweden is a Baltic country, so the trade between Baltic increased here. So Sweden also had a lot of income coming out of the trade, which helped the kingdom. But at the same time, the Germans were starting to really make an impact in Sweden around the late Middle Age, and to counter that, the Swedish kingdom allowed promoted even German immigration to the Swedish towns as a way to build up the Swedish economy to be able to compete with the Germans, southern cities. And that's explain why the Swedish state really, it's very important to stress this, I think. It's really westernized is, I think, a word. Through the Germans and through Christianity and the contact with the bigger Europe, Sweden really become part of the western part instead of being, well, it still is, but less degree North Europe preferably. But at the same time as this happened with the growing influence from Germany and Hansa, the contacts between the Nordic kingdoms increased, and especially the nobility. The kingdoms, the ruling families too, but especially the nobility started to marry with each other and became connected. Of course, this was a bigger factor in the border region, and this was, I guess, the nobility in the Sweden, Norway, Denmark was really threatened about the nobility and the merchant from Germany. The growing contact between the Nordic countries led to establishment of the Kalmar Union, 1396. The reason why this happened was because they wanted to try to lower the influence from Germany or the German merchants, and also because by electing one king over this large area, the nobility have a lot of jobs to fill, because the king can't really rule this large area. And mainly, that's the whole fault of it. Was a failure from the start, basically. It was too large. Norway maybe was going to accept it. Denmark was always going to be on top, and Norway and Sweden wasn't really going to be in the bottom, and especially Sweden.